The cardboard box wasn't heavy. What weighed Caleb Whitmore down was the silence in the elevator as he carried it to the lobby for the last time. No one stopped him. A few coworkers looked up, then quickly looked away. Someone muttered, "I'm sorry," but it sounded more like a habit than a feeling. Caleb pushed through the glass doors into the cold October air, balancing the box against his hip. Inside were 20 years of memories reduced to a framed photo, a coffee mug with a faded company logo, and a notebook filled with ideas that would never become projects. His phone buzzed. "Lillian, are you still coming to my volleyball game tonight?" He stared at the message for a moment before typing back. "Wouldn't miss it." That answer mattered more than the meeting he had just walked out of. Driving away from the corporate campus, Caleb kept replaying the same sentence. "We're eliminating your position." Not because he had failed. Not because he had broken rules. Simply because someone had decided the company could operate with fewer people. He wanted to be angry. Instead, he felt strangely empty. Before heading home, he parked outside the high school gym. Parents were already filling the bleachers. He forced a smile onto his face before stepping inside. Lillian spotted him almost immediately. "You made it! I told you I would!" She hugged him without noticing his trembling hands. For 90 minutes, Caleb cheered louder than anyone in the gym. Every point she scored made him forget the cardboard box waiting in the trunk. Only on the drive home did she ask the question he had been dreading. "So, how was your meeting today?" He kept his eyes on the road. "It was different than I expected." She studied him for a second, then nodded. "Different good or different bad?" He smiled just enough to keep her from worrying. "We'll figure things out." She accepted the answer, but Caleb knew she deserved the truth someday. "If you've ever had life change in a single afternoon, tell me, how old are you, where are you watching from, and have you ever gone through something like this?" The weeks that followed moved with quiet cruelty. Caleb polished his resume. He applied everywhere. Food manufacturers, distribution companies, regional suppliers. Every interview ended with the same polite promise. "We'll keep your information on file." Savings became grocery money. The emergency fund became mortgage payments. He canceled streaming subscriptions, postponed repairs, and quietly sold the fishing boat he and Lillian used every summer. He never mentioned it. She simply noticed the empty space beside the garage one Saturday morning. One rainy afternoon, while driving home from another interview that had gone nowhere, Caleb took a side street he rarely used. That's when he saw it. A weathered brick bakery sat on the corner, its windows dusty, and its sign hanging slightly crooked. Hawthorne Bakery below it. Another sign leaned against the door. Bank foreclosure. For sale. Most people would have seen a business that had already failed. Caleb saw something else. Not success. Not easy money. Just a place where nobody could decide he was no longer necessary. He pulled his truck to the curb and sat there long after the rain stopped, staring through the dark windows, unaware that one quiet decision was about to change far more than his career. The first thing Caleb Whitmore bought wasn't flour. It was a mop. The old bakery smelled like stale dust, burned sugar, and years of forgotten mornings. Sunlight slipped through the front windows, revealing tiny particles floating through the air like memories no one had bothered to clean away. Lillian stood beside him, hands on her hips, looking around the empty room. So, this place is kind of depressing." Caleb laughed for the first time in weeks. "That's one way to put it." She smiled. "But I think it could be beautiful." That single sentence was enough to keep him from questioning the decision he'd already signed his name to. The realtor had called it a fixer-upper. The bank had called it a distressed property. Caleb simply called it a second chance. Unfortunately, second chances came with leaking pipes, cracked tiles, broken shelving, and ovens older than either of them expected. The first week disappeared beneath cleaning supplies, paint rollers, and countless trips to the hardware store. Every dollar mattered. When Caleb hesitated over buying brand new display shelves, Lillian quietly walked toward a thrift store across town. They found 2 solid wooden cabinets for less than the cost of one new shelf. "They have character," she said. "They have scratches." "So do we." He smiled. "Fair point." Neither of them knew much about baking. Managing supply chains had taught Caleb how products moved across the country, but none of that explained why bread refused to rise or why pie crusts cracked at the edges. His luck changed when he met Walter Jensen. Walter was 73, a retired baker whose family had owned another bakery decades earlier before retiring to a quiet life nearby. He stopped by after seeing lights on inside the abandoned shop. "You planning to open?" "I'm planning to try." Walter nodded. "Trying's a good start." The next morning, Walter returned carrying an old canvas apron. "I can't stay forever," he said, "but I can stop you from making every mistake I already made." Those lessons became Caleb's favorite part of each day. Walter never rushed. "Don't fight the dough," he often said. "It already knows what it's supposed to become." Caleb found himself thinking that maybe people work the same way. Lillian loved watching Walter teach her father. Whenever Caleb ruined another batch of biscuits or overmixed cookie dough, she would grin without mercy. "I hope your supply chain experience is helping." "It is." "How?" "I now understand how expensive mistakes can be." Slowly, laughter returned to the building. Fresh paint covered faded walls. Old windows finally sparkled. A handmade chalkboard replaced the faded menu that had hung untouched for years. When opening day finally arrived, Caleb barely slept the night before. He expected crowds. Instead, only 4 customers walked through the door. One bought a loaf of sourdough. Another ordered coffee. An elderly couple shared a cinnamon roll by the window. That was all. By noon, Caleb couldn't hide his disappointment. Walter noticed. "You know what every good bakery has in common?" Caleb shrugged. "They're busy?" Walter shook his head. "They're patient." Business grew one familiar face at a time. Mrs. Donnelly from the library stopped in every Tuesday. The firefighters from Station 8 began grabbing muffins before dawn shifts. A mail carrier started buying 2 blueberry scones every Friday because one was always for his wife. Caleb remembered every name, every favorite order, every birthday, every conversation. Without realizing it, he had stopped trying to build a successful bakery. He was building a place where people felt recognized. The money, however, wasn't keeping pace with the goodwill. Ingredient prices climbed. Utility bills arrived with uncomfortable regularity. Some nights Caleb stayed after closing, quietly studying spreadsheets while pretending everything was under control. Whenever Lillian asked how things looked financially, he gave the same answer. "We're getting there." She wanted to believe him. He wanted to believe himself. Then one Thursday afternoon, while Caleb was kneading bread in the kitchen, the shop phone rang. Lillian answered. After a short conversation, she covered the receiver with her hand. "Dad? What is it?" "A regional grocery company wants to talk about carrying our bread." Caleb looked up, flour covering both hands. For the first time since losing everything, the future seemed to crack open just enough for hope to shine through. He had no idea that opportunity and temptation had just arrived together. The meeting with the grocery company lasted less than 40 minutes, but Caleb Whitmore thought about it for days afterward. The buyer wasn't interested in fancy pastries or elaborate cakes. "We like your bread," she said. "People are asking for local products. We'd like to test your bakery in 5 stores. 5 stores. It didn't sound enormous compared to the corporate projects Caleb used to manage, but for Hawthorne Bakery, it felt almost impossible. "We'd need fresh deliveries 6 mornings a week," the buyer continued. "Consistency matters more than volume." Caleb nodded confidently. "We can do that." Walking back to his truck, he repeated those 3 words to himself. "We can do that." The problem was, he wasn't completely sure they could. Back at the bakery, Lillian could tell something had changed before he even spoke. "Good news? The best we've had in months." She hugged him before hearing the details. When he explained the proposal, her eyes lit up. This is amazing! It could be. The difference between those two words barely registered to her, but Caleb understood it perfectly. An opportunity wasn't success. It was responsibility. Within a week, the bakery looked different. New ingredient deliveries arrived almost every morning. Storage shelves filled faster than ever. Walter smiled as he watched the organized chaos. Looks like business found you. I've been hoping for that. Walter gave him a thoughtful look. Just don't start chasing it. Caleb laughed. I'm only trying to keep up. But keeping up quickly became running. He started arriving before 4 every morning. After baking came deliveries. After deliveries came customers. After customers came bookkeeping. Then cleaning. Then planning the next day's production. By the time he locked the front door each night, his shoulders ached so badly that lifting the key felt like work. Lillian noticed before he admitted anything. You missed dinner again. I grabbed something earlier. She looked at the untouched sandwich still sitting on the office desk. No, you didn't. He forced a smile. I forgot. She crossed her arms. You've said that 3 times this week. It's temporary. You said that last week too. Caleb kissed the top of her head. This contract could change everything. She wanted to believe him. Instead, she quietly washed mixing bowls while watching her father move from one unfinished task to another without ever sitting down. The small staff noticed it too. Miguel, the morning baker, offered to handle more of the bread production. I've got it, Caleb replied. Emily volunteered to organize supplier orders. I'll take care of it. Walter suggested closing one day each week to avoid burnout. We can't afford that. Every offer received the same answer. Caleb wasn't trying to control everyone. He simply couldn't stop believing that if anything went wrong, it would be his fault alone. Late one evening, Lillian found him asleep at the office desk with invoices scattered across the counter. His reading glasses had slipped halfway down his nose. The calculator was still in his hand. She quietly covered him with an old flannel jacket before turning off the lights. The next morning, he woke before sunrise, embarrassed that she'd seen him like that. I'm fine, he insisted over breakfast. She stirred her oatmeal without looking up. I know you're tired. I'm okay. Dad? He finally met her eyes. You don't have to prove anything to me. The words stayed with him all day. Unfortunately, another voice inside his head was louder. Don't fail again. By the end of the month, Hawthorne Bakery had become busier than Caleb had ever imagined. Customers filled the front counter. Delivery vans came and went. The ovens rarely cooled. From the sidewalk, the little brick building looked like a success story. Only Caleb knew how close everything was to stretching beyond its limits. Just after sunrise one crisp Monday morning, a sleek black sedan pulled quietly into the parking space across from the bakery. The engine shut off. A woman stepped out wearing a charcoal wool coat and paused for several seconds, studying the storefront, as if she already knew the man inside. Then she walked toward the front door. The bell above the front door chimed just as Caleb slid another tray of sourdough onto the display shelf. I'll be right with you, he called without looking up. The smell of fresh bread filled the bakery, warm enough to make almost anyone feel at home. Almost. When Caleb turned around, the smile he wore for every customer disappeared before he realized it. Vivian Cross stood quietly near the entrance. Her charcoal coat was neatly buttoned against the autumn chill, and her silver-streaked brown hair was pulled back with the same precision he remembered from years in the corporate office. She wasn't carrying a briefcase or surrounded by assistants. For the first time since he'd met her, she looked like an ordinary customer. Either of them spoke for several long seconds. Lillian looked from one face to the other. Dad? Caleb took a slow breath. What can I get for you? Vivian glanced at the menu before answering. A loaf of your country. Sourdough, and a cup of black coffee. His hands moved automatically, slicing bread, pouring coffee, wrapping the loaf in brown paper. Years of managing pressure kept his voice steady even while his pulse refused to slow. That'll be $11.40. She handed him a credit card. No explanation. No apology. No awkward small talk. Only after the receipt printed did she finally meet his eyes. You've built something nice. Caleb folded the receipt and slid it across the counter. We're still building. She nodded once, studying the room instead of him. A young firefighter laughed with Miguel near the pastry case. Mrs. Donnelly waved at Lillian while picking up her usual blueberry muffin. Two construction workers argued good-naturedly over which pie to take back to the job site. The bakery felt alive. Vivian noticed everything. So people know your name here. They know everyone's name. A faint smile crossed her face. That wasn't always true where we worked. Before Caleb could answer, the oven timer rang. He excused himself, carrying fresh rolls from the kitchen while another customer stepped to the register. The morning rush returned with familiar energy, and for several minutes the bakery became nothing but conversation, ringing cash registers, and the comforting rhythm of ordinary life. Vivian didn't leave immediately. She sat alone near the front window, slowly drinking her coffee while watching the shop around her. She noticed Caleb lifting 50-pound bags of flour by himself even though Miguel was available to help. She watched him answer the phone while boxing pastries at the same time. She saw him skip breakfast, wipe sweat from his forehead with his sleeve, then hurry to greet another customer before anyone could notice how tired he looked. When the line finally disappeared, she stood and walked back to the counter. You still carry everything yourself, she said quietly. Caleb frowned. I run a small bakery now. That's part of the job. She shook her head. No. Her voice remained calm. That's the story you keep telling yourself. He stared at her without replying. Vivian rested one hand lightly on the wrapped loaf of bread. Years ago, I believed. Your greatest strength was how much pressure you could survive. She paused. I don't think I understood the cost. For a moment, neither of them looked away. Then she picked up her bread, thanked Lillian with a polite smile, and walked out into the cool morning air. Caleb watched the black sedan disappear down Main Street. The bakery was busy again within seconds. Customers kept ordering. The ovens kept baking. Life kept moving. But one sentence lingered louder than the ringing cash register. That's the story you keep telling yourself. For 3 straight weeks, the lights inside Hawthorne Bakery came on before anyone else in town was awake. By 3:30 every morning, Caleb Whitmore was already measuring flour, checking dough temperatures, and reviewing delivery schedules with a pencil tucked behind his ear. The grocery chain's trial order had started better than anyone expected. Their bread sold quickly, and every successful delivery seemed to bring another request. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like trying to outrun a wave that never stopped rising. Walter noticed the change first. You've stopped tasting the bread. Caleb looked up from a clipboard. What? You used to cut every first loaf open. I trust the recipe now. Walter folded his arms. No. You trust the schedule. The words lingered, but Caleb brushed them aside. There wasn't time to think. A mixer needed cleaning. A supplier wanted confirmation on tomorrow's shipment. The front register froze for 10 minutes during the breakfast rush. Someone had to solve every problem. In Caleb's mind, that someone was always him. Miguel walked into the kitchen carrying 2 heavy flour sacks. I can finish today's sandwich rolls. I've got it. You've already been here 4 hours. I said I've got it. Miguel didn't argue. He quietly carried the flour back to storage instead. From the front counter, Lillian saw the exchange. She said nothing. She simply watched another person stop trying to help her father. That afternoon, Emily approached Caleb with a stack of invoices. I reorganized these by due date. Thanks. You missed 2 supplier payments. I'll handle them tonight. You don't have to do everything alone. Caleb offered a tired smile. It's faster this way. Emily hesitated before placing the folder back on his desk. It isn't. After she walked away, Caleb opened the invoices. Electricity. Butter. Commercial yeast. Packaging. Every bill was slightly higher than the month before. He closed the folder without letting himself calculate the total. The next few days blurred together. Coffee replaced breakfast. Standing replaced sleep. Hope slowly became pressure. Then came Friday. The bakery had its largest production schedule since opening. The grocery chain needed an additional emergency order before the weekend. Every oven was running. Every counter was covered. The kitchen felt hotter than usual. Walter checked the old brick ovens twice. They're working harder than they were built to. They'll make it. You sound very sure. I have to be. Just before noon, a sharp metallic pop echoed through the kitchen. The largest oven went silent. The smell of overheated wiring replaced the smell of fresh bread. The digital controls went black. No. Caleb whispered. Miguel immediately shut off the remaining equipment. Walter inspected the control panel. We're done until this is repaired. Caleb grabbed the maintenance manual as though reading faster might restart the machine. It has to work. It doesn't. We have deliveries. Walter rested a hand on his shoulder. And a broken oven. Silence filled the kitchen. Then another problem appeared. Emily leaned against the prep table, breathing heavily. You okay? Lillian asked. Emily forced a smile. Before she finished the sentence, her knees buckled. Miguel caught her before she hit the floor. She hadn't eaten since dawn. She'd worked 11 straight hours. The ambulance wasn't necessary, but the paramedic who examined her gave Caleb a look he couldn't ignore. She needs rest. I told her to take breaks. The paramedic glanced around the exhausted staff. Did she think she could? No one answered. By late afternoon, cancelled deliveries filled Caleb's voicemail. Customers called asking why stores had empty shelves. The grocery buyer left a message requesting an urgent meeting on Monday. Caleb sat alone in the office after everyone went home. The bakery was finally quiet. Too quiet. He reached for another invoice and froze. The folder wasn't where he'd left it. Lillian stood in the doorway holding it. I wasn't snooping, she said softly. I was looking for printer paper. She stepped inside and placed several envelopes on the desk. Past due notices. Supplier reminders. A short-term business loan statement he had never mentioned. She looked at him with confusion more than anger. You borrowed money? Caleb lowered his eyes. I didn't want you worrying. So instead, you let me believe everything was fine. I was trying to protect you. She gently shook her head. You keep saying that. He searched for the right words but found none. Her voice remained calm. Dad, when Mom died, you told me families get through hard things by telling each other the truth. She looked around the tiny office, at the unpaid bills, the cold coffee, the blanket folded over the chair where she'd found him sleeping more than once. When did that stop applying to us? The question hit harder than losing his job ever had. For the first time since buying the bakery, Caleb wasn't thinking about the broken oven, the grocery contract, or the unpaid invoices. He was thinking about something far more unsettling. Without realizing it, he had rebuilt the same kind of workplace, and the same kind of home, that ran on one person's silence while everyone else quietly carried the consequences. The bakery stayed closed the next morning. For the first time since Caleb Whitmore bought Hawthorne Bakery, there was no smell of fresh bread drifting onto Main Street. The handwritten sign on the front door simply read, "Closed today. We'll be back soon. Thank you for your patience." Inside, the silence felt unfamiliar. Caleb sat alone at one of the cafe tables, staring at a notebook that was still open to yesterday's production schedule. Every task had been carefully planned. Every delivery had been timed to the minute. None of it mattered now. Lillian walked out of the kitchen carrying 2 mugs of coffee. She slid one across the table. I made it. Caleb managed a tired smile. I hope it's better than mine. It definitely is. For a while, either of them spoke. Outside, a few regular customers stopped, read the sign, then quietly walked away. None of them knocked on the door. Finally, Caleb broke the silence. I owe you an apology. Lillian looked up. You don't owe me perfection. I know. You owe me honesty. He nodded slowly. When I lost my job, I promised myself you'd never have to worry about money again. She listened without interrupting. I thought if I worked hard enough, if I fixed every problem before you saw it, then I'd be doing my job as your dad. His voice caught. But somewhere along the way, I stopped letting you be part of our life. Lillian wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. I never needed you to protect me from every hard thing. I know that now. No. She smiled sadly. I think you're just starting to. The conversation lasted almost 2 hours. For the first time, Caleb showed her every invoice. Every loan payment. Every supplier bill. Every missed deadline. Nothing stayed hidden inside desk drawers anymore. Instead of panicking, Lillian reached for a pencil. What can we actually change? The question surprised him. She wasn't asking how to erase the problem. She was asking how to live with the truth. Together they drew a fresh page in the notebook. No more overnight production 7 days a week. No more accepting every custom order. Miguel would oversee morning bread production. Emily would manage purchasing and invoices once she returned. One afternoon each week would be reserved for equipment maintenance instead of baking. The bakery would become smaller before it became stronger. For the first time in weeks, the notebook contained a plan that didn't require Caleb to sacrifice himself. Just before noon, someone knocked gently on the locked front door. Caleb looked up. Vivian Cross stood outside carrying no briefcase, no folders, and no trace of corporate authority. Only a small white bakery box from another shop across town. He opened the door. We're closed. I know. She held up the box. I didn't come to buy bread. After a brief hesitation, Caleb stepped aside. Vivian placed the unopened box on the nearest table. I wasn't sure bringing pastries to a bakery was appropriate. Lillian almost smiled. It isn't. For the first time, all three of them laughed quietly. The tension eased just enough for honesty to enter the room. Vivian looked directly at Caleb. I heard about yesterday. We'll recover. I believe you will. She paused before continuing. When we eliminated your position, I convinced myself the respectful thing was to stay distant. Caleb said nothing. I thought contacting you afterward would only make things harder. She looked around the empty bakery. I understand now that silence can hurt people just as much as bad decisions. The words weren't polished. They weren't rehearsed. They sounded like someone who had spent years carrying a conversation she never had. Caleb leaned against the counter. I blamed you for everything. You had reasons. I did. He looked toward the notebook still lying open on the table. But yesterday I realized something. Vivian waited. I've been running this place the same way I ran my old life. She followed his gaze to the pages filled with crossed-out schedules and rewritten responsibilities. Trying to carry every burden yourself? He nodded. I kept telling myself I was protecting everyone. And were you? Caleb thought about Miguel, Emily, Walter, and especially Lillian. No. The answer came easier than he expected. Vivian didn't offer business advice. She didn't mention the grocery contract. She didn't suggest investors, consultants, or rescue plans. Instead, she stood, thanked Lillian for the coffee, and walked toward the door. Before leaving, she turned back one last time. Sometimes the strongest leaders aren't the ones who can carry the most. She smiled gently. They're the ones who finally trust other people to help carry it. After she left, Caleb looked at the bakery around him. Nothing had been repaired yet. The oven was still broken. Bills were still waiting. The grocery company's meeting was only days away. But for the first time since losing his career, he wasn't trying to build the future alone. Monday morning arrived with clear skies and a knot in Caleb Whitmore's stomach. The repair technician had managed to get the main oven running again, but only after warning him that it wouldn't last forever. It'll do the job, the technician said while packing his tools. Just don't ask it to do 3 jobs at once. Those words echoed in Caleb's mind as he locked the bakery and drove to the grocery company's regional office. The conference room looked familiar in a way he hadn't expected. A polished table, coffee in paper cups, sales reports neatly stacked in front of each chair. For years, rooms like this had been his workplace. Today he sat on the other side. Across from him, the grocery buyer smiled politely. "We've been pleased with customer response." Caleb nodded. "I'm glad to hear that." She slid a folder across the table. "We'd like to expand." His heart skipped. The proposal was far larger than the original trial. Instead of supplying 5 stores, Hawthorne Bakery would produce bread for 22 locations across the region. The projected revenue was more money than Caleb had imagined earning during the bakery's first several years. "We'll need production to begin next month," the buyer explained. "Can you meet the volume?" For a moment, Caleb didn't answer. A few weeks earlier, he would have said yes before the sentence was finished. Now he pictured Emily collapsing onto the bakery floor, Miguel quietly carrying work that Caleb refused to share, Walter warning him that old ovens and old habits could only take so much pressure. Most of all, he remembered Lillian asking one simple question: "When did honesty stop applying to us?" The buyer mistook his silence for negotiation. "We're open to discussing pricing." "It isn't the price." "Then what's the concern?" Caleb opened the folder again. Every page represented growth. Every page also represented another chance to repeat the same mistake. "If I accept this," he said carefully, "I'd have to double production almost overnight." "Yes. I'd need more staff." "That's normal." "I'd have to increase hours." She nodded. "That's business." Caleb looked down at the contract. No. That wasn't the kind of business he wanted anymore. He closed the folder. "I'm honored by the offer." The buyer smiled. "We're excited too. But I can't sign this." The smile faded. "I'm sorry. My bakery isn't ready." She blinked. "You understand how unusual it is for someone to turn down this kind of opportunity." "I do." "Then help me understand." Caleb leaned forward. "I can promise you numbers I might reach." He paused. "Or I can promise you bread we'll actually be proud to deliver." Silence settled over the room. Finally, he continued. "I can reliably serve 8 stores." The buyer frowned. "The proposal is for 22. "I know. And if we say no? Then we'll keep serving the customers who already trust us." She studied him for several long seconds. "You'd risk losing the entire contract?" "I'd rather lose a contract than build a business my employees dread walking into every morning." When Caleb left the meeting, he had no idea what decision the grocery company would make. For the first time in months, uncertainty didn't frighten him. Back at the bakery, everyone looked up the moment he walked through the door. Lillian searched his face. "How did it go?" Caleb set the unsigned contract on the counter. "I turned down the expansion." Nobody spoke. Miguel was the first to break the silence. "You what?" "I offered a smaller partnership." Walter slowly smiled. "I was wondering when you'd finally start thinking like a baker instead of an executive." Caleb laughed softly. "I think I'm still learning." Lillian walked around the counter and hugged him. Not because the future was secure. Not because the bills had disappeared. But because, for the first time since he had carried that cardboard box out of his old office, his decisions were no longer driven by fear. Outside, customers began lining up as the front door opened for the morning. Inside, the bakery felt different. The ovens were warm. The shelves slowly filled with fresh bread. Nothing looked extraordinary. Yet everyone working there could feel it. The business had stopped chasing growth. It had finally started protecting the people who made it worth growing at all. 3 days passed before the grocery company called back. Caleb Whitmore was carrying 2 trays of fresh sandwich rolls into the display case when the bakery phone rang. Lillian answered. "Hawthorne Bakery. This is Lillian." She listened for a few seconds before covering the receiver. It's the regional buyer. Caleb wiped flour from his hands onto his apron and picked up the phone. This is Caleb. Mr. Whitmore, we've reviewed your proposal. He waited. We're not moving forward with the 22-store rollout. The words landed exactly as he expected. I understand. There was a brief pause. But we'd like to test your 8-store plan. Caleb blinked. I'm sorry, could you repeat that? You were the first supplier we've worked with who reduced their own opportunity instead of exaggerating capacity. She continued before he could answer. Our team debated it quite a bit. Caleb leaned against the counter. We'd rather build a partnership with someone who knows his limits than one who promises what he can't deliver. A slow smile spread across his face. Thank you. We'll review performance after 6 months. I think that's fair. When he hung up, the bakery was quiet. Lillian looked at him. Well? He laughed, a real laugh this time. We're baking for 8 stores. Walter took his old baseball cap. Now that's a number an oven can believe. Everyone laughed. It wasn't celebration because they'd become successful overnight. It was relief that they wouldn't have to sacrifice themselves just to survive. The following weeks looked very different from the months before. Miguel took complete responsibility for the early morning bread production. Emily returned after recovering and reorganized purchasing, supplier payments, and inventory so efficiently that ingredients stopped arriving at the last possible moment. Walter came by only twice a week now. Instead of teaching recipes, he mostly stood with a cup of coffee, watching everyone work together. You know what I like? He said one morning. Caleb looked up from shaping dough. What? You finally walk around this place instead of running. Caleb smiled. I didn't notice. That's because you're finally paying attention to people instead of clocks. The biggest surprise wasn't the business. It was home. Evenings slowly returned. Dinner happened at the kitchen table instead of over spreadsheets. Sometimes Caleb and Lillian argued over whose turn it was to wash dishes. Sometimes they watched old baseball games without anyone opening a laptop halfway through. The bakery had become part of their life instead of replacing it. One chilly Saturday afternoon, the familiar black sedan parked outside once again. Vivian Cross stepped inside carrying nothing except a reusable shopping bag. The lunch crowd recognized her only as another customer waiting patiently in line. When she reached the counter, Caleb greeted her with the same smile he gave everyone else. Good afternoon. Looks busy. It usually is. But not chaotic. He laughed softly. We're working on that. She ordered a loaf of sourdough and 2 apple turnovers. While Lillian boxed the order, Vivian glanced toward the open kitchen. Miguel was teaching a new employee how to score bread before baking. Emily was checking inventory with a clipboard in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other. Nobody looked frightened. Nobody rushed from one crisis to another. The bakery felt calm. Vivian turned back to Caleb. I heard about your counteroffer. News travels. It surprised a lot of people. It surprised me too. She rested her hand lightly on the counter. You know, years ago, if someone had walked into my office and admitted they couldn't handle a larger operation. She smiled to herself. I probably would have chosen another supplier. Caleb waited. I thought confidence meant saying yes. And now? She looked around the bakery once more. Now I think confidence is knowing when yes becomes a lie. Either of them spoke for several seconds. There wasn't anything left to defend. Nothing left to explain. The past hadn't disappeared. It simply no longer controlled the present. Before leaving, Vivian paused near the front door. I've started changing the way our executive team handles layoffs. Caleb looked at her with quiet curiosity. No speeches, she said. No promises to make people feel better. She shrugged gently. Just time, honest conversations, and helping people leave with their dignity intact. Caleb nodded. I hope it helps. So do I. She walked out carrying her bread, blending into the ordinary Saturday crowd on Main Street. Caleb watched her go for only a moment before another customer stepped forward. "What can I get for you today?" He returned to work without looking back. Not because the past had been forgotten. Because it no longer needed to be carried. The ovens hummed steadily. Fresh loaves cooled on wooden racks. Lillian laughed at something Miguel said from the kitchen. For the first time since Hawthorne Bakery opened, every person inside the building was doing exactly the work they were meant to do. And Caleb finally understood that a business wasn't measured by how much one person could endure. It was measured by how many people could thrive together. 6 months later, the first thing people noticed about Hawthorne Bakery wasn't the bread. It was the pace. The front door opened at 7 every morning, just as it always had. Fresh loaves lined the wooden shelves, coffee steamed behind the counter, and familiar faces drifted through the shop with the easy rhythm of neighbors who had made the bakery part of their routine. Nothing felt rushed anymore. Caleb Whitmore unlocked the door each morning before sunrise, but he no longer arrived in the middle of the night. Miguel had already mixed the first batches of dough. Emily's ordering system kept the pantry stocked without emergency phone calls or overdue invoices. The old oven still worked, though Caleb finally scheduled regular maintenance instead of waiting for another crisis. Walter still visited every Wednesday. He claimed he came for free coffee. Nobody believed him. He usually stood near the front window, watching customers come and go with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had planted a seed and lived long enough to see it grow. One morning he watched Caleb laughing with a young employee who had accidentally burned a tray of dinner rolls. Months earlier, Caleb would have grabbed the tray, remade everything himself, and apologized to every customer before anyone even complained. Instead, he smiled. "Good," he said. The young man looked confused. "Good? You'll never forget that smell now." Everyone laughed, including the embarrassed employee. Walter quietly shook his head. "That's a different man." Caleb overheard him. "No," he replied with a grin. "Just a slower learner than I thought." At home, life had changed in ways that couldn't be measured on financial statements. Dinner happened almost every evening around the same kitchen table. Sometimes Caleb cooked. Sometimes Lillian insisted on experimenting with recipes that didn't always turn out as planned. They argued about whose turn it was to clean the dishes. They teased each other over terrible movie choices. Ordinary moments had quietly become the reward Caleb had been chasing without realizing it. One Friday evening, Lillian sat at the counter finishing a college scholarship essay while Caleb cleaned flour from beneath his fingernails after work. She looked up from her laptop. "My English teacher asked us to write about someone who changed our life." Caleb smiled. "I hope you picked someone impressive." "I did." She closed the computer. "I wrote about you." He looked away for a moment, pretending to straighten a towel that didn't need folding. "I don't know about that." "You taught me something." "What's that?" "That being strong doesn't mean pretending everything is okay." She paused. "It means telling the truth before people have to discover it on their own." For a second, Caleb couldn't find an answer. He simply reached across the counter and squeezed her hand. Some lessons took years to understand. Others took only one honest conversation. A few days later, Vivian Cross stopped by again. She waited her turn behind construction workers, teachers, and a young mother with 2 energetic children. No one treated her differently because no one knew who she had once been to Caleb. When she reached the register, she ordered the same sourdough loaf and black coffee she always did. As Caleb handed her the bag, she looked around the bakery. "It feels peaceful." He nodded. "That's harder to build than success." "I believe that now." She smiled, thanked him, and walked out carrying nothing more than bread for the weekend. Neither of them needed another conversation. The past had found its proper place, not erased, not celebrated, simply acknowledged. The grocery partnership continued with 8 stores, exactly as planned. It wasn't the fastest-growing bakery in the county, and Caleb had stopped caring about that. Customers kept coming because the bread was fresh. Employees stayed because they were respected. Lillian kept believing in her father because he had stopped trying to be perfect. On a cool autumn morning, almost 1 year after he had carried a cardboard box out of a corporate office, Caleb unlocked the bakery door as the first rays of sunlight spilled across Main Street. He turned the sign from closed to open. Behind him, laughter drifted from the kitchen as Miguel and Emily prepared the day's first batches. Lillian walked in carrying 2 cups of coffee, handing one to her father before tying on her apron. "You ready?" she asked. Caleb looked around the little bakery that had once seemed far too broken to save. The walls still had imperfections. The old oven still creaked. The shelves weren't always full. But every person inside belonged there. He smiled. "Yeah." Then father and daughter opened the door together, welcoming another ordinary day, the kind of day Caleb had once overlooked, and now understood was the richest life he could ever hope to build.